Same chapter, Filtering Reality, in the book Intellectuals and Society, first published in 2011, republished with a few added chapters, although not this one, I think, in 2021. Just as it is hard to find any consistent correlation between gun ownership and violent crime rates internationally, it is hard to find any such correlation from historical statistics within the United States. As one study noted, quote, the United States experienced an extraordinary increase in violent crime in the 1960s and 1970s, and a remarkable drop in violent crime in the 1990s. The number of firearms, especially handguns, in private hands increased by several million every year during this period. The relentless growth in the privately held stock of firearms cannot explain both the crime wave of the first period and the crime drop of the second period. Few of these facts detrimental to gun control advocates' case reach the general public, although there is no organized conspiracy to block the truth. Individual ad hoc filtering of what gets through the media to the public can readily add up to as complete a distortion of reality as if there were a conscious coordination by a heavy-handed censorship or propaganda agency. If those individual journalists and editors who do the filtering share the same general vision of what is and what ought to be. What seems plausible to those who share that vision can become the criterion of both believability and newsworthiness. Plausibility, however, is the most treacherous of all criteria, for what will seem plausible in a particular case depends on what one already believes in general. It is not necessary for either individuals or a cabal to work out a plan of deliberate deception for filtering of information to produce a distorted picture that resembles the vision of the anointed rather than the reality of the world. All that is necessary is that those in a position to filter, whether as reporters, editors, teachers, scholars, or movie makers, decide that there are certain aspects of reality that the masses would misunderstand, and which a sense of social responsibility requires those in a position to filter to leave out. This applies far beyond issues of gun control.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
As always, he is right on the money, both analytically and also the way he presents these things. It's just, it hits you over the head every time.
Yeah, and I can't at the moment think of a major story to which this isn't applying, right? Like this.
Yep.
Certainly the last 3 years of COVID, in which the entire world and, to some degree, us specifically have been informed that you may not have those conversations. You may not investigate those questions because doing so adds an element of doubt into the minds of the masses, basically. And, the argument is one of, his argument, his word, it's the anointed versus all the rest of us. And at some level, what we have been accused of doing is breaking ranks.
Mm-hmm.
You got your fancy degrees. You're the anointed. Don't do this. Right? And, we have somewhat fancy degrees, but more to the point, are scientists.
Yeah, we got degrees in truth-seeking.
Right. And what actually are all of those other people with supposed degrees in truth-seeking up to? Because either they never could do it, in which case their degrees are shams, which some of them are, or they are actively lying to themselves and or to everyone else, in which case they don't deserve to stand as if with authority and speak words that, whether or not they know it, aren't true.
What was the initial publication?
2011.
Date? 2011. Mm-hmm. So I did want to highlight one thing. He's correct that you don't need a conspiracy to get these things. Mm-hmm. We, however, are living in 2023.
We are.
And the fact that a conspiracy is not necessary to get this kind of narrative control doesn't mean that we don't have one. And in fact, it's out in the open, right? That we see the Department of Homeland Security warning us about dis, and malinformation. And oh, by the way, it happens to be a form of terrorism, which creates a whole network of laws, or I hesitate to call them laws because they're clearly unconstitutional. But anyway,
Diktats.
Yes, mechanisms are triggered by the invoking of those syllables by the executive of which the DHS is part. And so by defining certain beliefs...
DHS is part of the executive branch?
Yeah.
Okay.
The point is the executive himself, our senile president in this case, could define you as a terrorist for speaking truth that was inconvenient to the narrative, which would be malinformation, for example.
And the fact that he couldn't remember having done so half an hour later is irrelevant.
All the better. It's a feature, not a bug. Yeah. So anyway, the point is we have seen conspiracies at many different levels. We have seen conspiracies at the federal level, especially the executive branch. We have seen Gavi. We have seen the Trusted News Initiative. We have seen inside the Twitter files. And the point is there's a vast bulwark attempting to control the narrative in the interests of something that inhabits the costume of our government, but is really a pretender. That thing is exerting tremendous control. And the point is, look, this is an authoritarian, a cryptically authoritarian state. The idea that, yes, you don't need a conspiracy to get, news organizations to broadcast something convenient to those that butter their bread, but it doesn't mean you don't have one. And in this case, the basic point is if you lived in the Soviet Union in, the 70s, you knew pretty well to ignore the official proclamations of your government, even though they came through an ostensibly journalistic establishment at Pravda, right? I
think so. I mean, I'm actually increasingly, I'm very curious how people living in particular spaces and times, in particular places and times, actually did regard what was happening. These last 3 years have been eye-opening in terms of how people will tie themselves in knots to demonstrate to themselves and to the rest of the world that they are the good people on the right side of history while explicitly being the opposite.
Well, I do think that this would have been evident to any thinking person living inside the Soviet Union in the 70s or 80s. Yeah. And I think that what we face is much more confusing, right? Because it isn't an authoritarian state. And so we don't expect it to lie to us at this level. And we don't expect it to punish citizens because how, of course, would you do that? That would be illegal for the federal government to punish citizens for wrongthink. In the U.S., what about the First Amendment? And yet we see it happening through all of these public-private partnerships, as they are falsely called.
When we think of corruption, we come up with, things that we've experienced. Trying to drive through a country in Latin America and being stopped by the police and being told that we need to give them cash before we can continue on. Right?
Yes, the on-the-spot fine.
The on-the-spot fine, which we've literally had happen to us.
Yep.
Like that, that's what corruption looks like, right? Being asked when I went in to get my research permits in Madagascar, as a graduate student who was literally making $13,000 a year and had gotten a grant to do my research in Madagascar, by the person behind the counter, where's my Land Rover? That was the first ask. I don't have a Land Rover. I ended up delivering a bottle of whiskey. Like that, it went down from Land Rover to whiskey. Like, okay.
That's how negotiation works.
That'll do it, right? And we went through computer. This would have been in the 90s. So, yeah, it's like, I didn't arrive in Madagascar with a mainframe for you. So, anyway, that's both the cartoon version and, yeah, it does exist. Like, corruption does exist like that in countries where there is such great disparity of wealth, and officials can line their pockets a little bit by seeing who might have money and extracting it from them. But that's not almost ever what it looks like in the weird world. And that doesn't mean that corruption isn't happening.
Right. And, yes, the kind of corruption where some local authority extracts funds from people is bad, but the amount of harm done by the large-scale, very polite, well-dressed executive level corruption is vastly greater. Mm-hmm.
I'd far rather be asked to pay in a bottle of whiskey every now and again.
Sure.
Yes.
That's a world you can live in.
Yeah. But lest I be misunderstood, the government of Madagascar is not functional, or at least it certainly wasn't in the 90s. And
it can't be.
Right. So I'm not saying that overall it's a more functional system. I'm saying if I had to choose between these two kinds of corruption in isolation, the simple tit for tat exchange that is visible and that is apparent to everyone is far easier to contend with.
Yes, and anyway, there's a much longer conversation to be had, but once you've seen truly malignant government, cannot help but see the point of the libertarians. Libertarians are, tragically wrong on the game theory, but frankly, I would much rather live in a system harmed by the absence of necessary laws than one in which the lawmaking authority is corrupt and malevolent and effective, which is where we are.